There's something about understanding who you are, especially on assignment, that changes the way you do what you do. Sometimes it even changes what you do. Not just the motivation behind it, the why, but the actual tasks, the job. An example might be a soldier in combat who has a battle plan before the battle begins, but as the battle wages on, suddenly the enemy does something unexpected. The enemy dodges when you think they're going to dart. They dart when you think they're going to dodge. They zig when you think they're going to zag. And you find that the plans you had laid out, your strategy, your business plan, your educational goals, your relationship plans, they're all out the window. Everything you had planned out won't work because the atmosphere has shifted. The environment is different than what you planned for. Now what? I'm J Loren Norris from Tell It Like It Is TV. I'm glad you're here today for the Leading Leaders podcast. I want you to think for a moment about the last time that you had a plan. Maybe it was a simple plan for how you were going to spend your Saturday afternoon. And then suddenly all the lawn work you had planned, all the tools laid out, then gas and oil in the trimmer, the gas for the lawnmower, the blade is sharpened, everything is good to go. And when you wake up Saturday morning, a thunderstorm rolls in. Everything you'd planned in the yard is gone. Maybe you planned to spend the day at the park or the paint gallery or spend time cleaning the house. And then you lock your keys in the car and you spend 3 hours waiting on a locksmith. I sat in the park playing with my grandson last night, and the lady next to me was explaining how she locked her keys in her truck, and that meant the keys to her apartment were locked in the truck and she couldn't get into her apartment. And they didn't have a lockout service. So she was stuck in the park with her 5-year-old at 8 o'clock at night going, bath time has already come and gone. Homework time has already come and gone. All my evening shows have already come and gone. And here I sit with no opportunity or ability to change the circumstances that I find myself in. Her only strategy was to wait for her husband to get home. There was no lockout service for her apartment. There was no extra set of keys to the truck. Well, there was, but they're in the apartment. So she had to wait for her husband to get home. Those are not fun days, but they kind of happen to everybody, don't they? They happen to everybody. Circumstances change, environments change, atmospheres change. And we've been talking all this week about how we as leaders have to influence the environment around us. We can either speak into the environment and make changes that way. We can change the who that we are in the environment and make changes that way. We can bring a different level of influence into the atmosphere and make changes that way. Or we can just go with the flow. You know, there are a lot of people who live their life working with the path of least resistance. And there's something you need to know about the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance always goes with the flow. Now, generally speaking, water, electricity, and people all go to the path of least resistance, even when that's the most damaging path. If we are influencers, if we are leaders and changers in the environment around us, we've got to be willing to push against that. We've got to be willing to not just go with the flow, but to change the direction of the flow. Like a salmon swimming upstream, that might be a small amount of influence. I'm talking about a jetty, not a yeti. A yeti is a cooler. A jetty is a pile of rocks that changes the pace of the water as it's moving downstream. Somewhere between a jetty and a dam, you influence the culture as it flows, or you redirect it altogether. See, the challenge that we have today is we have too many leaders who are caught up in the flow of celebrity, in the flow of consciousness, in the flow of the media, in the flow of politics, in the flow of wealth. Their ability to influence and redirect the culture and the atmosphere has been minimalized significantly, if not removed altogether. And the challenge that we have is that when we get caught up in the flow, well, we lose our sense of direction. The flow goes where everybody else is going. The flow is like moving with the crowd down the streets of Manhattan. Try going the other way. It doesn't work very well. You're caught up in the flow. Now you can put up some barricades and redirect people and maybe change the direction of the flow, but the flow is going to keep going where the flow goes. If you've ever been swept up in peer pressure or mob mentality, or that's the easiest way to go because that's the way everybody does it. If you've ever been caught up in one of those type of scenarios, you know what I mean by being caught up in the flow. You also know how hard it is to alter that direction. To change your own direction is difficult. To change the direction of so many other people, well, that seems sometimes near impossible. It's not impossible, but it is challenging. And what I really want to encourage you to do as leaders is to find that foundational connection that's outside the flow. What is it that you're about? Your identity, your passions, your vision. What have you been called to do that doesn't look like doing what everybody else is doing? Now, if what you've been called to do is right in the center of that flow and going right along with them, well, then rock on. But I find that generally leaders who are equipped to lead, who are trained to lead, who are prepared to lead, who are passionate about leading, are not go with the flow kind of people. In fact, their calling, their equipping, are usually signs that they have an assignment different than going with the flow. Leaders are generally here on this earth to make a mark, to make a change, to redirect, to create a new realm of influence, to design a new atmosphere. And if that's what you have been called to, then you have work to do. And to do anything other than that, that's a failure. And I don't mean the kind of failure where you fall down and you learn. I mean the kind of failure like a cataclysmic failure. I mean the you have wasted what you've been given kind of failure. That the talents that were invested in you were not invested by you kind of failure. The take the talent from the one who buried it in the ground and give it to the one who's actually using it kind of failure. Oh yeah, you can recover from it. There are second chances and thirds and 23rds and 77th chances. But you've got to recognize if you're not influencing the flow, if you're not bumping against that stream and pushing it in a better direction, if you're not walking upstream in some circumstances, you're not influencing the flow. You're just going along with it. Sometimes it's hard to recognize in your own environment where that flow is going and whether it's good or bad. And that, my friend, is an identity question. Who knew leaders had an identity crisis? The reality is many leaders have an identity crisis. They don't know what their role on earth is supposed to be. They haven't asked the question long enough to get the solid answer. They don't have a vision clear enough in their head to take those marching orders from and to walk against the current, to resist against the flow, to make changes in the atmosphere and the environment or the circumstances around them. Politically, they get swept up. You ever watched how a flood changes the landscape? A flood, all the debris and the water, the force of the water, and sometimes the mud that gets caught up in it, it will move like a driving force and it just rearranges the entire landscape behind it. I mean, when you put 8 pounds per gallon behind 30,000 gallons of water moving in a simple direction, it doesn't even have to move fast. It just doesn't stop. But along the way, it might gather some trees, and then a house or two, and then a few hundred cars. And as it continues to move, that flood, that tide, that flow, it can rearrange everything in its path, destroy it, wash it out to nothing, to absolutely nothing. And that flow is what we're talking about. That flow of consciousness, that flow of culture, that flow of shift and change, it's been set in motion for centuries. But it's not always good. And sometimes it needs to be redirected away from our families. Sometimes it needs to be redirected away from our schools or from our business or from our churches or from our circle of friends. And if we as leaders don't stand our ground and engineer our leadership in such a way as to not only resist the flow, but redirect the flow, then we will be caught up in the flow. That takes some advanced planning. You know what else it takes? It takes the ability sometimes to recognize this is not the battle, now is not the time to fight. Step aside, let the flow go where the flow goes, and get ahead of it in another way. If you want some mind-boggling concepts of that, go back and watch some of the floods of the Midwest, especially ones that involve the Ohio River. Because the Ohio River doesn't run just north and south. It is a squirrely river that runs east and west. It's kind of like the Red River or the Rio Grande. They run east and west, north and south. And there are places when you look at the Ohio River, especially around, say, Portsmouth, Ohio, and Lexington, Kentucky, right in that area where it runs northeast, then southwest, then west, then east, then... And as you're looking at that river, you're thinking, well, which direction is the water really flowing? And the answer is yes. And when it floods, it goes every direction from that space. How do you influence a river like that? Well, drive through the area sometime and you'll see some of the creative ways that the locals have found to control that river, to deal with its flooding stages because they're perpetual, to deal with the direction of the water when it floods. They've made a way for that. They understand what the environment around them is like and what it's going to take to influence the flow. But see, we haven't figured that out in many places in our culture because we haven't identified the fact that we are in the path of the flow and the flow is going to change us if we don't change it. If our influence isn't strong enough, if our anchor isn't strong enough, if our foundation isn't strong enough in our identity, when the flood comes, we're going to get swept up in it. That's something that we as leaders should not be easily accepting. As leaders, we should be able to put our feet down and say, I'm not going along with the flow. What is it about you, about your vision, about your values, about your morals, about your character, about your identity, that say, I won't go along with the flow? Again, if your calling is to go along with the flow and influence it from the inside, more power to you. But I don't find that's the case with most leaders. I find that most leaders have a calling because they have a different vision, different morals, different foundation, different integrity, and they have a calling to do something entirely different than what the flow is doing. Are you okay with middle school library books that have pornographic images in them? If not, it's time to go against the flow. Are you okay with politicians who are corrupt, who can rob the government blind and the people as well? If not, then it's time to stand up. It's time to voice your opinion. It's time to go against the flow. It's time to influence the flow. Maybe that means you get involved in politics. Maybe that means you give to those who are. Maybe it means you support a campaign or get out the vote. But do something as a leader to influence the flow. Don't just get caught up in it and get trapped in it. If what you believe about who you are, what you're called to, what you're assigned to, is different than what you see in the flow of culture and society today, it's time to put your foot down It's time to get anchored in your foundation and realize, like is true of most battle plans, they don't last past 15 minutes engaged with the enemy. When you put your foot down and resist the flow, things are going to change. They're going to change in your life. They're going to change around you. And the influence will get even harder. It seems, and you may have done this before. When I was a kid, we used to do it all the time. We'd find the rapids in the river, like on the Guadalupe or the Colorado River. We'd find the water where the water was really moving fast, and we would try to stand our ground where it was moving really fast. And it took a lot of effort just to stand still. And it seems like, well, if I just relax and go with the flow of the water, then everything will be easier, right? But the truth of the matter is, the water doesn't care once you're in the flow whether it's going to take you straight downstream in a nice cushiony bed of water, or if it's going to slam you into every other rock and tree limb along the way. And the odds are higher that if you relax and go with the flow, you're going to get beat up pretty bad before the water stops. So yes, struggling against the flow takes a lot of effort. It also means that somewhere along the way, something may come down the river at you while you're standing your ground that is an immovable force, an irresistible force. You're an immovable object, it's an irresistible force. That water is one thing, but when it's floating a tree limb or a boat or a car or a house, it's a whole different ball game. What's your strategy then? If you're fighting in the stream of politics or faith or family values, while you're fighting in that stream, something is going to come at you. What's your strategy then? See, when you're anchored to something bigger than you, when your values are more than just your own personal opinion, when the people that you intend to influence is greater than your circle of friends and your family, there's a lot at stake when you're resisting the flow. By not resisting, everyone is impacted. By relaxing and going with the flow, you're not the only one who'll be battered and bruised at the end of this journey. But you need a sound strategy. If you're going to stand firm in the middle of the river, what do you do when the tree comes? And I can tell you there's a story of a guy named Philip. You should look him up. He had one of those strategies of going against the flow. And at one point in his strategy, he was in one place, and then poof, he was in another place. And he was going against the flow. He was bucking against the system. He was pushing against the Roman government. But he had some outside help that realized that he was needed somewhere else. And his battle plan, his business plan, his strategy, all went out the window. And in an instant, he was moved from one place to another to complete the task that needed to be completed, because he was surrendered to the task. He was surrendered to the values that he held dear. He was surrendered to the call on his life, and not just to resisting the flow. When he was needed to resist the flow somewhere else, he went. In fact, he was just translated from one place to another. Yeah, I have to look that story up. It's pretty fascinating. Are you that surrendered to the call in your life? Are you that committed to going against the flow? I want you to challenge yourself with that question today. If you say you're a leader, influence is your job. But what will you influence? Your culture? The atmosphere? The environment around you? How hard will you resist the flow of culture and society to stand firm for what you believe? I'm J Loren Norris, and you've been watching Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.